Alright, so this is going to be a quick video concerning the shooting by police of a fellow named Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta and the riot-like behavior that has ensued in response to that shooting. Now, I expect that the response to this shooting will be different than the response to the shooting of people like George Floyd, because I suspect that a lot of people, including people not on the right, will see that this shooting was justified, or at least should not be taken as evidence of racial bias in the criminal justice system. And in fact, I think what makes this event interesting is the fact that there is a violent response, despite the seeming obvious unreasonableness of that response. Again, not just to someone like me, but I think to a fairly large number of people. But maybe I'm being overly optimistic about how people will react to this. This is very much still an evolving story, and so time will tell. For anyone who doesn't know, here's a quick summary of what happened, and it should be noted that all of this is on video, not only in the form of a video from the Wendy's, but also from the body cameras of the police officers, all of which has been released. This is all very easily verifiable in the most concrete way imaginable. So this Brooks fellow was asleep while in a drive-thru to Wendy's. The police had a calm and fairly agreeable exchange with him while determining that he was intoxicated. Specifically, he'd been drinking. They then attempted to arrest him for a DUI. Brooks resisted that arrest. He fought with the officers. He stole a taser from them, and then he began to flee from them, and at the same time as he was fleeing from them, aimed the taser at them, seemingly in an attempt to shoot the officers with it. The officers had been pleading with Brooks to stop fighting throughout this incident until he stole the taser, at which point they fatally shot Mr. Brooks. I think to any sane person, the obvious response here is that it is not surprising that police would shoot you if you fight with them, steal their taser, and try to shoot them with it. That even removing police from the situation, if you try to shoot a private citizen with a taser, especially in a state like Georgia, there's a reasonable chance you could end up being injured or even shot by that person. There's obviously no reason to think that the police would not have also shot this fellow had he been white, and I think a fair number of people would go as far as saying that the police were just outright justified in shooting Mr. Brooks because he was beginning to attempt to assault the police officers in a fairly serious way. Again, I may be being overly optimistic, but I don't expect this to be very controversial outside of a fairly small number of people on the far left. That being said, a small percentage of people on the far left is a sufficient number of people in a country as large as ours and in a city as large as Atlanta to cause serious problems. And in fact, the response to this incident so far has included the police chief resigning, the cop involved in the incident being fired and condemned by the city's mayor, the Wendy's at which this event occurred being set on fire, as well as cars nearby, as you can see in the image here, and the interstate in Atlanta being shut down by protesters. Now, very quickly, because I feel it's almost obligatory, I do want to note the usual problems that the narrative surrounding this event from the Black Lives Matter people features, as do the narratives concerning many other police shootings. So firstly, there's no direct evidence that a different outcome would have occurred had the suspect been white. As always, there's just no reason to think this. Black people are killed by police at a lower rate than what would be expected, given their general rates of violent crime and potentially fatal interactions with police officers. And black police officers are at least as likely as white police officers to kill black suspects, making racial animus a very poor explanation for the disproportionate rate at which black people are killed, especially when we have another explanation, namely, again, the rate at which they are involved in crime. Now, I'm not going to go into that in any detail. I will just link in the description an article of mine which goes into all the statistics behind these sorts of claims. And the reason that I'm not going to go into details is because, again, I'm hoping that this is just so obviously stupid that I don't need to, because the only sort of people who would not agree that this is obviously stupid are the sort of people whose statistics could never reach anyway. And so instead, I'm going to offer a different kind of analysis in response. So what we need to understand here is that this is an example of the fact that the norms that the left is instituting at the moment will lead to inevitable riots. Because if it seems even remotely plausible to leftists that a police shooting might have involved racial bias, they will assume it did and riot. That is what they're showing right now in Atlanta. Now, importantly, even if we live in a world where there is no racial bias in police shootings, there will still be police shootings, and black people will still be shot by police on occasion. And given the very low bar of evidence that the left requires, if even this shooting can justify a riot, such shootings will almost always be suspect. If it is true that leftists will riot in response to shootings that they consider suspect, and their bar of evidence for considering a shooting suspect is so low that they will usually consider shooting suspect even in a system that has no racial bias, well then obviously, even in the total absence of racial bias, the left will still carry out race riots. Now, of course, these kind of riots constitute a breakdown of law and order, and moreover, the response of weak city governments like Atlanta, where they condemn police and fire people in response to the complaints of woke idiots, well, obviously that also increases lawlessness, as, by the way, in a certain sense, does the response of strong city governments, which respond to chaos with suppressive force. And what I mean by that is that if a situation causes the state to violate its own laws, that still does constitute a breakdown of law and order. Again, in a certain sense, although it's a different sense, and we have seen that in certain cities where, as many people have noted, we've seen this dichotomy of the police letting people riot and destroy certain cities, and then in other cities, the police violently attacking people who very clearly are not breaking the law. And this reflects the fact that these riots, which themselves again constitute a kind of breaking down of law and order, make it very hard for the city governments to respond in a way that doesn't further increase a certain feeling of chaos. And so in the abstract, the cost of these riots is the sense that we live in a peaceful, orderly civilization, setting aside the more concrete costs, which are obvious in terms of, say, the economic cost of burning down businesses, the 20-plus people who were killed in the George Floyd riots, etc. Now, the left has an ultimatum that they're operating under here, which is essentially that if we don't stop enforcing laws on black people in ways that the left considers problematic, well, they're going to riot. The problem, as we can see in this instance, is that the left has no serious bar of evidence they use when determining whether or not a given instance of police violence is actually racist. And to the degree that they overestimate the prevalence of racism, they are saying that we will not allow society to function if police treat people of different races equally. That is the only way to ensure the left will not riot if they're overestimating the prevalence of racism, and at least sometimes getting upset about instances of supposed racism where there is no racist cause. Well, then the only way to ensure they won't riot is for police to preferentially avoid killing black people in instances where in reality they would have also killed white people. And so the conclusion then is that the left will riot unless black people are given legal privileges that white people are not. And this, of course, makes it impossible then to live in the kind of civilization that most people at least claim to want to live in, a civilization where people's legal rights and how they're treated by the government does not depend upon their race. Instead, let's just call it what it is, the left is currently, at least in this moment, instituting norms such that they will riot unless we institute a kind of legal black supremacism. And so I want to conclude this video by just stressing the idea that evidence matters, that you could say a lot of things are wrong with this, but one of the most important things that is wrong with this, which is also reflective of something more generally wrong with how the left approaches these racial issues, is that they have a very low bar of evidence that they require in order to determine that an incident or a system or a civilization is racist against black people. And this is a good example of the fact that that low bar of evidence can lead you to false conclusions, which can then lead you to act in ways such that the system you're actually fighting for is not racial equality, but in fact a society that systematically privileges certain groups over the people who, on the basis of very little evidence, you are calling a racist, and in this case, as is usual, that is white people. And if you are willing to irrationally accuse people of doing immoral things on the basis of their race, as the left is, in the case of accusing white people of doing things for racist reasons, well, that itself is, of course, a form of racism, specifically racism against white people. And if you can see that in this instance, if in this instance you can see that the biases of leftist ideology lead it to conclusions which are racist against white people, well, I think that should give you some reason to investigate the view that this is true of leftist ideology, more generally speaking. And in fact, I'll leave an article going over statistical evidence considering that more generally as well in the description. And with that said, I think I'm just going to end the video here.